the man who should have won. There is a question that haunts the corridors of 20th century history like a ghost that refuses to leave. It is not a question about battles or treaties or the rise of empires. It is a quieter, more unsettling question, the kind that keeps historians awake at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling. What if the most qualified man for the job simply lost? Not because he was defeated in battle, not because fate struck him down in some dramatic moment of historical thunder, but because he failed to see the door closing, slowly, silently, one hinge at a time, until it was already shut and locked from the inside. That man was Leon Trotsky, and this is the story of how the most brilliant, most celebrated, most feared revolutionary of his generation was outmaneuvered by a man his own colleagues barely noticed. To understand how extraordinary Trotsky's fall was, you first have to understand how extraordinary Trotsky was. By 1922, Leon Trotsky was not simply a powerful figure within the Bolshevik Party. He was, by almost every measurable standard, the dominant force of the Russian Revolution. He had co-organized the October Revolution of 1917 alongside Lenin. The two of them were the engine and the spark of the entire enterprise. When the revolution succeeded, the world press wrote about Lenin and Trotsky as an inseparable pair. To speak of one was to invoke the other. But Trotsky's greatest achievement, the one that should have secured his political future forever, was something even more staggering. He built the Red Army from nothing. Think about what that means. In 1918, the new Soviet state was surrounded by enemies on every side. Foreign powers intervened. White armies advanced. The revolution appeared to be dying in its cradle, and it was Trotsky who climbed into an armored train and crisscrossed the collapsing front lines, delivering speeches that turned demoralized conscripts into disciplined soldiers, transforming a collection of desperate men into a fighting force that would eventually win the Russian Civil War. He did not inherit an army. He invented one. American journalist Max Eastman, who had close access to the inner circles of the Bolshevik leadership, reported that by 1922, Trotsky's personal popularity within the party exceeded even that of Lenin, not by a small margin, by the kind of margin that makes political outcomes feel inevitable. At mass meetings, Trotsky's name drew longer applause. His speeches drew larger crowds. His writings circulated more widely. And then Lenin himself, the founder and undisputed moral authority of the Soviet state, did something almost without precedent. He personally offered Trotsky the post of deputy chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. In plain terms, Lenin looked around at the entire revolutionary generation and pointed at Trotsky as his chosen successor. This was not a rumor. This was not a whispered preference. This was a formal offer extended by the most powerful man in Russia to the man he trusted most. Trotsky declined. He said he was too busy. He had other work to do. He did not want to appear to be positioning himself. That single decision, that one quiet, almost modest refusal, may have been the most consequential political mistake of the 20th century. While all eyes were on Trotsky, a different man was doing a different kind of work. His name was Joseph Stalin, and in 1922, almost nobody considered him important. John Reed, the American journalist who wrote 10 Days That Shook the World, the most famous eyewitness account of the October Revolution, barely mentioned Stalin at all. He appeared in Reed's account as a peripheral figure, a face in the crowd, someone present but not particularly worth describing. This was not unusual. Most of the revolutionary generation treated Stalin the same way. He was not a great orator. He was not a theorist. He was not a battlefield commander or charismatic leader of men. He was the general secretary of the Communist Party. And nobody, almost literally nobody, thought that mattered. The general secretary managed administrative affairs. He processed paperwork. He handled appointments to committees and regional positions. He was, in the eyes of Trotsky and the other intellectual giants of the revolution, a bureaucrat, a functionary, the kind of man you needed around to keep things organized, but not the kind of man you worried about. This perception was so widespread, so deeply held, that even those who should have known better never questioned it. What they missed, what all of them missed, was that control over appointments meant control over people. Every regional committee, every party cell, every minor official who owed his position to Stalin's office was, in a quiet and deniable way, a piece on Stalin's board. He was not making speeches. He was building a structure, and the structure, piece by piece, was becoming his. Lenin was not blind to what was happening. In the final months of his active life, as his health collapsed around him, he dictated a series of documents that history would call his testament, a remarkable set of private notes intended to guide the party after his death. In December of 1922 and into January of 1923, unable to speak for extended periods, he dictated his assessments of the party's key figures. His words about Trotsky were complex. He was, Lenin wrote, the most capable man in the present Central Committee, but he was also marked by excessive self-assurance. His words about Stalin were something else entirely. Lenin wrote that Stalin had concentrated unlimited authority in his hands and that he was not sure whether he will always be capable of using that authority with sufficient caution. Then, in a postscript that shook those who heard it, Lenin went further. He recommended that Stalin be removed from his position as General Secretary. Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, the man whose word was approaching religious authority, said directly and in writing that Stalin should be dismissed. Lenin died in January of 1924. With him died the only person in the Soviet Union with the moral weight to act on that recommendation. When Lenin died, something happened that, in retrospect, looks like the precise moment the political balance tipped irreversibly. Stalin organized the funeral. He managed the logistics, choreographed the ceremony, carried the coffin, and delivered a formal address, a sweeping, almost liturgical pledge of loyalty to Lenin's legacy. To the thousands of party members watching, Stalin was the grieving disciple, the faithful servant, the man who honored the founder. The ceremony was set for a specific date. Trotsky, who was recovering from illness in the south of the country, later wrote that he received a telegram from Stalin informing him that the date of the funeral made it impossible for him to return in time. Historians have debated ever since whether that date was deliberately communicated incorrectly, whether Trotsky was, in effect, kept away. What is not debated is the result. Trotsky was absent. Stalin stood at Lenin's grave. Trotsky was somewhere else. For the party faithful, no further message was necessary. One man had shown up. One man had not. At the 13th Party Congress in 1924, Lenin's testament was read aloud to the assembled leadership. The room heard Lenin's explicit recommendation to remove Stalin. They heard his praise of Trotsky's abilities. Trotsky said nothing. He did not stand up and say, "The founder told you what to do. Do it." He did not call for a vote. He did not press the moment. He sat in silence while the most powerful weapon ever handed to him was quietly set aside and forgotten. By 1926, Stalin's former allies, Zinoviev and Kamenev, who had helped him isolate Trotsky in the early years, began to understand that they had been used. They saw the machine they had helped build turning toward them. In a moment of desperate clarity, they abandoned their alliance with Stalin and joined forces with Trotsky. It was by that point far too late. In November of 1927, all three, Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, were expelled from the party. In January of 1928, Trotsky was deported to Alma-Ata, a distant city at the edge of the Soviet world. In February of 1929, he was expelled from the Soviet Union entirely, beginning a life of exile that would carry him through Turkey, France, Norway, and finally Mexico. On the 20th of August, 1940, in a house in Mexico City, an agent named Ramon Mercader entered Trotsky's study and ended his life with a single blow. The man who built the Red Army, who co-made the revolution, who Lenin called the most capable man in the party, died in exile, 3 continents from the country he had helped create. Here's the paradox that makes this story different from an ordinary tale of political defeat. Trotsky did not lose in 1940. He did not even lose in 1927, when they expelled him from the party. He lost in 1922 and 1923, when he had every institutional resource, every political advantage, every tool he needed to win. He lost while he was still winning. The window of opportunity did not slam shut. It drifted closed quietly while he was looking at something else. And that is the most dangerous way any window can close. Not with a sound, but with a silence you only notice when you reach for the handle and find it gone. Most people, when they hear the story of Trotsky's fall, ask the wrong question. They ask, how did Stalin do it? They imagine a cold, calculating villain pulling strings in dark rooms, engineering conspiracies, outmaneuvering a helpless victim. And yes, Stalin was calculating. Stalin was patient in ways that bordered on inhuman. Stalin built networks of loyalty with the quiet, methodical dedication of a man who had decided that patience itself was a form of power. But that framing lets Trotsky off the hook in a way that distorts the real lesson of this story. The more honest question, the more useful, more uncomfortable, more illuminating question is this: what did Trotsky do and fail to do that made his defeat not just possible, but almost inevitable? Because the truth is that Trotsky did not simply lose to a stronger opponent, he lost to himself. He was defeated by his own character, his own blind spots, his own deeply held beliefs about how the world worked. Beliefs that happened to be catastrophically wrong for the specific game he was playing. This is the anatomy of that defeat. And it is, in the most unsettling way, a mirror. Every person who knew Leon Trotsky, colleagues, rivals, journalists, even his first wife, described him in almost identical terms. The words they reached for again and again were some variation of the same portrait. Brilliant, magnetic, impossible to be around for long. His first wife, Alexandra Sokolovskaya, who had known him since his earliest years as a revolutionary, noted that his arrogance was not incidental to his talent. It was proportional to it. The more capable he was, the more certain he became that he was the most capable person in any room. And in many rooms he was right. Which made the problem worse. Lenin himself, in the Testament, a document written out of deep respect and genuine affection, felt compelled to name excessive self-assurance as Trotsky's defining political weakness. This was not a casual observation. Lenin chose his words with surgical precision. He was telling the party, this man's greatest enemy is the mirror. The practical consequence of this arrogance was devastating and entirely self-inflicted. People who are made to feel small do not follow you loyally. They follow you conditionally. They follow you as long as they need you, or as long as they fear you, or as long as no better option has appeared. But the moment an alternative presents itself, a rival who makes them feel seen, valued, even merely tolerated, they will not hesitate. They will not feel guilty, because you never gave them a reason to feel loyal. You gave them reasons to feel diminished, and diminished people are always looking for the exit. Trotsky's meetings with party officials were, by multiple accounts, exercises in intellectual humiliation. He had no patience for slower thinkers. He did not conceal his contempt. He corrected, dismissed, and moved on, leaving behind him a trail of men who were technically his supporters and emotionally his enemies. Stalin, meanwhile, remembered birthdays. Trotsky's greatest achievement was also his greatest political trap. He had built the Red Army. He had turned millions of men into a disciplined fighting force. He had won a civil war. These were genuine world historical accomplishments, and they gave him something extremely valuable: military prestige, institutional authority within the armed forces, and a reputation that extended across the entire Soviet state. What they did not give him was control over the Communist Party itself. The party was the actual power structure of the Soviet system. It controlled appointments, ideology, resources, and legitimacy. Whoever controlled the party controlled everything else, including, eventually, the army. And within the party, Trotsky had almost no organized base of support. Anatoly Lunacharsky, the Soviet Commissar of Education and one of the most perceptive observers of the Bolshevik leadership, wrote something about Trotsky that reads today like a diagnosis delivered too late to help the patient. Lunacharsky noted that Trotsky was extremely poor at organizing even a small group of people. and that he had practically no devoted followers. He inspired admiration, he commanded respect, he generated awe, but he had not built relationships. He had not created networks of obligation. He had not done the slow, unglamorous work of making people feel that their futures were tied to his. While Trotsky was writing theoretical texts and delivering speeches that would be quoted for generations, Stalin was having quiet conversations with regional party secretaries. He was approving appointments. He was calling in small favors and extending slightly larger ones. He was weaving a web so fine and so patient that by the time anyone thought to look for it, it covered everything. The man who built an army had forgotten to build a coalition. Of all the mistakes Trotsky made, this one is perhaps the most psychologically fascinating and the most universally recognizable. He looked at Stalin and he saw nothing worth fearing. He called him a gray blur, a mediocrity, a bureaucratic creature with no original ideas, no vision, no genuine understanding of revolutionary theory. He said these things openly, repeatedly, and with the comfortable certainty of a man who believes that his own assessment of a situation is a situation. Now here's the critical point. Trotsky was not entirely wrong about Stalin's intellectual limitations. Stalin was not a theorist. He was not an orator in the Trotsky mold. He did not write with Trotsky's elegance or think with Trotsky's speed, but Trotsky's assessment was not merely an insult. It was a cognitive failure of the first order. By deciding that Stalin was not worth serious attention, Trotsky stopped watching him. He stopped tracking the appointments Stalin was making, the alliances he was quietly assembling, the way the Congress delegations were shifting in composition year by year. He dismissed the process because he had dismissed the man behind it. And while Trotsky looked away, Stalin was filling every available seat with someone who owed him something. By the time of the critical party votes in the mid-1920s, the outcome was not decided in the meeting rooms where arguments were made. It was decided months and years earlier in the administrative offices where delegate lists were compiled and regional secretaries were appointed. Trotsky walked into debates he believed he could win with superior arguments and discovered that the room had already voted before he opened his mouth. He had confused contempt with analysis, and that confusion cost him everything. Beneath all of these specific mistakes lay a deeper, more fundamental error. Trotsky carried a map in his head, a model of how power worked, how history moved, how political contests were decided, and that map was simply wrong for the world he was living in. Trotsky believed, with the conviction of a man who had seen it proven, that ideas drive history, that the right argument, made with sufficient clarity and force, would ultimately prevail. That history was a contest of visions, and the most compelling vision would win. This belief had served him magnificently during the revolutionary years, a period of genuine chaos when the ability to inspire, to articulate, to move crowds was the decisive skill. Stalin operated on a different belief entirely. He believed, and he was right for the phase of history they had entered, that control drives outcomes, that it does not matter who's right. It matters who has placed the right people in the right rooms. It matters who can make the outcome happen, regardless of what arguments are made against it. The revolution was over. The new phase had begun. It was no longer a contest of charisma and vision. It was a contest of institutions, appointments, and accumulated obligation. And Trotsky, optimized entirely for the first phase, walked into the second phase with the wrong set of tools, absolutely convinced they were the right ones. He was right about almost everything he predicted. His warnings about the dangers of Stalinist bureaucracy proved accurate. His analysis of where the Soviet system was heading proved correct. He was, in the purely intellectual sense, vindicated by history. And he lost anyway, because being right is not the same as winning, and understanding history is not the same as understanding power. There is a principle buried in this story that extends far beyond the specific tragedy of one brilliant man in one brutal century. The most dangerous person in any room is not the most intelligent. It is not the most articulate, the most visionary, or the most historically significant. The most dangerous person in the room is the one who, long before you arrived, made sure that everyone already present owes them something. Trotsky gave the world its most spectacular proof of this principle. He stood at the summit of history with every advantage: talent, fame, the founder's blessing, the loyalty of millions of soldiers, and lost to a man nobody had bothered to watch because watching him seemed beneath their dignity. The door closed, quietly, without drama, and the man who should have won spent the last 11 years of his life in exile, writing books about why he was right. He was, and it changed nothing.